Good morning, everyone. Has anyone here ever tried to calculate their personal carbon footprint? Maybe you filled in one of those online questionnaires designed to help you calculate how your daily life, traveling to work, buying food, going on holiday, is contributing to climate change. Well, what you probably didn't know was that the idea of a personal carbon footprint didn't come from some well meaning green NGO. No. The personal carbon footprint was designed in 2004 as part of an advertising campaign for none other than multinational oil company BP. Now let's unpack this. Why would an oil company like BP would want you to spend time agonizing about how much of a burden you are on the planet? As a lawyer, I can tell you how I see it. For a fossil fuel company who wants to avoid legal liability and avoid regulation of its greenhouse gas emissions, distraction is the very first line of defense. Let me explain. In South Africa in 2021, the average person was responsible for 7.34 tons of CO2 equivalent being emitted into the atmosphere. For the sake of argument, let's call it 7 tons of CO2 equivalent per person. BP, on the other hand, was responsible for 340 million tons of CO2 equivalent in 2022. That is 48 million times more than the average person living in South Africa. In 2017, researchers published a list of 100 fossil fuel producers who are responsible for emitting 70% of the world's greenhouse gas emissions over the last 20 years. Just 100 companies, now known as the carbon majors, are responsible for 70% of all emissions these last 2 decades. But it gets worse. The carbon majors list shows that just 4 multinational companies are responsible for more than 10% of all the world's carbon emissions since 1965. Chevron, Exxon, Shell, and yes, you guessed it, BP. Together, oil companies and their investors have made trillions of dollars in profits from the very products and processes that directly cause global warming and climate change. In 2022 alone, which was a bumper year, the big Western oil companies made $200 billion in profits. In our profit-driven economic system, for as long as fossil fuel companies are raking in these mind-boggling kinds of profits, they are going to be doing all they can to hold on to those profits for as long as possible. Fossil fuel companies have a long and successful track record of resisting liability for past emissions and of lobbying to derail attempts to regulate their current and future emissions. So perhaps you can see why these companies would want us to spend time feeling responsible for causing climate change and distract us from thinking about their greenhouse gas emissions. In March this year, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change made it clear, once again, that to keep to 1.5 degrees warming, we need to halve global greenhouse gas emissions by 2030. That's less than 7 years away. If we cannot do this, we are entering a far more dangerous era of higher temperatures and extreme weather events. In South Africa, we're living the start of this changing and less stable climate. With temperatures rising, parts of our country are getting drier, water supply constraints are growing in all our major metros, risks from flooding like we saw in KwaZulu-Natal in 2022 are rising, and the malaria footprint is expanding. And yet, despite all the warnings from scientists urgently to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, global emissions are still rising. Even today, almost all state and commercial banks, including South African banks, continue to finance fossil fuel projects. So if the numbers show that a small number of fossil fuel companies are overwhelmingly responsible for climate change, how do we hold them and their financial backers legally accountable and force them to stop the harm they're doing to the climate and to our future? All over the world, lawyers like me are exploring ways to do just that. Did you know that 2,000 climate lawsuits have been filed in courts across the globe since 2011? More than 2,000. And not only have lawyers already been surprisingly successful in many of those cases, we are also increasingly getting creative in how we use the law to affect change. Let me give you some examples of some of the success stories, as well as some of the cases in the pipeline. For the past decade or more, lawyers have successfully challenged hundreds of new fossil fuel projects all over the world, from United States to Australia to Indonesia. Here in South Africa, lawyers representing NGOs scuppered plans for a whole fleet of new coal power plants between 2017 and 2020 by successfully suing the state for not considering the climate impact of these plants. Last year, a lawsuit famously stopped oil major Shell from conducting environmentally devastating seismic testing for offshore oil and gas. Within the next year or so, a case known as the Cancel Coal case will be heard in the South African courts. In this case, youth and community groups are challenging the South African state's procurement of all new coal power as a violation of our constitutional rights because of the impact of burning coal on people's physical and mental health and on the climate. In other cases, lawyers have sued corporations directly to get those companies to reduce their emissions. In 2021, in a landmark case brought by a group of Dutch NGOs, a Dutch court ordered Shell to reduce its greenhouse gas emissions by 45% by 2030. Lawyers are also helping people who are already suffering the impacts of climate change to claim compensation from those responsible. In Germany, a closely watched case brought by a farmer from Peru against the German energy company RWE, which is one of the carbon majors, is winding its way through the courts. In this case, the farmer claims damages for RWE's contribution to the melting of a glacier that's putting his town at risk. Now imagine that Peruvian farmer's claim against one of the carbon majors, replicated millions of times over against all of the carbon majors, as climate impacts start to bite, particularly in the global south, where countries have, of course, contributed far less to global warming and have fewer resources to respond to climate tragedies. So think about the residents of Durban here in South Africa, who were struck by an extreme rainfall event exacerbated by climate change in April last year. More than 400 people died. Thousands of people lost their homes and livelihoods. South African insurance companies had to pay billions of rands in claims, though, of course, many people who lost their homes did not have insurance. Government was left with an estimated bill of $1 billion US, a tab that has to be picked up by South African taxpayers. Potentially all of these victims have claims, including through class actions for the loss and damage suffered worldwide by small businesses, by ordinary people, by local governments, as a direct result of the harm caused by fossil fuel companies. The question is whether fossil fuel companies and their shareholders are preparing themselves for a tsunami of claims for loss and damage. In 2017, Hurricane Maria caused catastrophic damage in the Caribbean. Now, lawyers acting for 16 Puerto Rican municipalities are suing Exxon, Chevron, Shell, BP, and a long list of carbon majors for damages, relying, amongst other things, on racketeering laws, usually reserved for mob bosses and perpetrators of organized crime. The personal liability of directors of fossil fuel companies is also gaining attention, and those directors should be very nervous. Many jurisdictions already recognize that directors can be sued in their personal capacity if the companies fail to protect the company and its shareholders from climate risk. So if you think this is far-fetched, think again. Last year, public interest lawyers asked a British court to rule on whether Shell's board of directors is breaching its duty to shareholders and can therefore be held personally liable. Here is another interesting question. Is it possible to hold fossil fuel companies and the people behind them directly criminally liable for the lives lost in these climate tragedies? The answer is that it may just be possible. Earlier this year, authors writing in the Harvard Environmental Law Review argued that oil companies should be charged with climate homicide. Since oil companies have known for a long time that they are contributing to global warming, the authors argue that they have the required culpable mental state to be criminally prosecuted for the deaths caused by climate change. The outcome of all of these cases will have far-reaching implications for fossil fuel companies, their directors, and their shareholders. So watch this space. At its core, law is about fairness. Laws and courts should defend what is fair and beneficial for our society, including for future generations, and prevent what is unjust and harmful. And because there is so much about climate change that is unfair, as we speak, international and domestic law across the world is being developed by legislators, by judges, and public interest lawyers to repair this injustice, to hold those who are responsible for climate change liable, and to compel them to stop harming the planet. But of course, the fossil fuel industry is not going down without a fight. You will not be surprised to hear that across the world, lawyers pursuing climate justice are increasingly facing persecution. They're being threatened, they're being sued, even jailed. If we care about the future of this planet, we must defend the rule of law and stand behind climate lawyers' ability to hold fossil fuel companies and those who enable them to account. The one thing the law is not is a quick fix. The wheels of justice turn very slowly. And not every case will be successful. The fossil fuel industry, of course, has very deep pockets to defend themselves. Legal action on its own will also not be enough to bring about the radical behavioral and structural change we need to respond to the climate crisis. But the law is a critical building block in the broader movement for climate justice. Not only are lawyers blocking escape routes for fossil fuel companies who are trying to squeeze the very last profits from fossil fuels, but we are steadily building a new legal framework for a more just, more resilient, post-carbon society. The situation we face could not be more serious. Nothing less than our ability to live on this planet is at stake. Fossil fuel companies and everyone who continues to profit from their deadly operations should know this. The law is coming for you.